carried off by a lion. By R.S. Parmenter. The facts of this remarkable story have been vouched for by Major J.S. Hamilton, Warden of the Transvaal Government Game Reserves, and Sir Alfred Pease, Acting Resident Magistrate of the Barberton District, South Africa. The story I propose to tell is perhaps unequaled in the stirring annals of big game adventure how a man, bruised and battered, extricated himself from the clutches of a hungry lion and killed it with an ordinary sheath knife. The hero of this extraordinary incident is Game Ranger Wolhuter, of the Transvaal Government Game Reserve of South Africa. On August 26 of 1946 Wolhuter was riding on his patrols, well mounted, and carrying a good rifle. The moon had already come up, and by its light he picked his way along a native path that led to the Sabi River. It was rather uncanny, this solitary ride along the lonely, moonlit veldt, and the ranger almost wished he had not ridden on ahead of the boys, though he was anxious to finish his journey. To occupy his mind he talked to his big, shaggy-haired dog, which leaped and gamboled by his side. Suddenly, however, the hound stopped short and started barking at some movement in the bush. For the moment the Kanga thought it was deer, but directly after the dog rushed snarling at a lion, which was crouching on the offside of the path. Wolhuter knew instinctively that the great brute was going to spring, so he turned his horse sharply in the other direction. The movement was successful, for the great beast missed him, but struck the horse, his claws tearing its quarter. While Wolhuter was fumbling for his arms, the wounded horse gave a terrific bound, which threw him out of the saddle with so much force that he rolled several feet. In his fall he dropped both his rifle and revolver. Though the shock of the fall was a pretty severe one, it had not disabled him, and he was picking himself up when, to his horror, another lion, evidently the mate of the first, jumped at him from the bush, and seized him by the right shoulder. The brute then trotted off, carrying the unfortunate ranger as easily as a feather, his head up and his body and legs under the animal's chest. The lion kept up a growling, purring noise as a cat does when she has caught a mouse, only magnified many times. In spite of his awful position, Wolhuter did not lose his senses. He saw the first lion rush off in pursuit of his terrified horse, and wondered what his dog was doing. The horrible purring of the tawny monster that held him droned in his ears like the unceasing hum of a busy street. It tortured him and made his head feel as if it was splitting, while the pain where the brute's fangs were buried in his shoulder was excruciating. At first the beast trotted round in a circle, and presently the ranger spied his revolver lying on the ground, where it had fallen when jerked from his grasp. As they passed over the place, Wolhuter pluckily reached out his arm for the weapon, though the action gave him intense agony, but he only grazed his hand on the rough ground, for the lion, increasing his speed, went off at a swinging trot, evidently anticipating a tasty meal. Livingstone tells us of his indifference, and the total absence of pain he experienced when seized by a lion, but Wolhuter says this was not at all the case in his experience. The torture he passed through was indescribable. The teeth of the beast in his shoulder felt like hot iron burning into him, and the jerking he received at each step seemed to be tearing him to pieces. It seemed impossible that he could ever get out of this awful position alive. Although he had almost given himself up to a horrible death, the ranger kept thinking of plans of escape, each one more impossible than the other, till finally, with the jolting and the pain, he began to bleed at the nose. This relieved him a little and his brain cleared, so that he saw the absurdity of his plans. Before long, however, a species of madness took possession of him, a delirium of pain. Then, suddenly, there flashed through his throbbing head the word, knife. Knife. For a few moments he repeated, knife, knife, without being able to grasp its meaning. At last, he remembered that he had a strong sheath knife hanging at his belt. Could he secure it and kill or wound the lion? The problem was how to get hold of the dagger, for he was being hurried along at a rapid rate. His reflections were interrupted by continual wrenches at his feet, and looking down he saw that his spars were catching in the uneven ground they were traversing and were wrenching his ankles fearfully. The torture did not last long, however, for the leathers burst and the spurs fell off. Thereupon he redirected his attention to the knife. Seizing hold of the belt in front, at the buckle, he was about to unbuckle it, but fearing that he might drop it, He slowly began to twist the belt round, and to his joy felt the knife coming nearer and nearer to his left side. Then he cautiously reached out his left hand and caught hold of the rough horn hilt. A thrill went through him, as his fingers closed around it. Slowly and with infinite care, so as not to drop it, he drew the knife from the sheath. The question now was, where should he strike? It must, if possible, be a mortal blow, for a slight wound would only infuriate the lion and cause him to finish his victim then and there. The great brute and his captive were now on somewhat broken ground, and the ranger was being roughly jolted to and fro, which increased his sufferings tenfold. By this time, he had been dragged over 200 yards from the place where the lion first seized him. As they came near a tree, Wolhuter summoned up all his resolution and pricked the lion with his knife, whereupon the animal stopped momentarily. Here was the ranger's opportunity. With all his might he stabbed the animal, twice in the right side near where he judged the heart to be, each time driving the knife in up to the hilt. Immediately, the grip on his shoulders relaxed and he dropped among the roots of the tree, striking at the lion's throat again as he fell. Battered and bruised, Wolhuter staggered to his feet, wondering what would happen next. The lion, snarling angrily, and with blood gushing from its wounds, seemed about to rush at him. At this moment, however, he remembered having read somewhere of the effect of the human voice on wild animals, and began to shout all the opprobrious epithets he could think of. Whether the flow of language shocked the brute it is impossible to say. The fact remains that after a brief period of hesitation the lion turned away and went off growling. The exhausted ranger immediately climbed the tree and reached a forked branch some dozen feet from the ground. Here he securely seated himself, but, fearing that he might fall, owing to his increasing weakness, he lashed himself firmly to the trunk with his belt and handkerchief. He could still hear the lion growling somewhere near, but after a time the growl became a moan, and finally the sound ceased altogether. Wolhuter felt certain that the brute was dead, and was just congratulating himself on his providential escape when he saw the other lion which, it will be remembered, had gone off in chase of his horse approaching at a ripple rate. The animal was following his spoor, and presently arrived at the base of the tree where the sorely tried ranger sat. Behind the lion was Wolhuter's faithful dog, which had apparently followed him throughout, and which, on a feeble shout of encouragement from its master, attacked the lion vigorously. Snarling savagely, the brute charged him, but the hound cleverly dodged, until finally the lion went off in disgust. Half an hour later the ranger's native boys appeared on the scene, and found their master unconscious, lashed in the fork of the tree. One of their number promptly climbed up and brought the wounded man down. He was placed in a blanket between 4 or 5 of the men and hurried to Barberton Hospital, while the others searched around for the lion. They discovered him not far off stone dead. The first knife thrust had touched the bottom of the heart, while the second had slit it up. The animal was an old male, with a perfectly empty stomach. The horse was caught the next day, little the worse for his mauling and the subsequent chase by the first lion. Game Ranger Wolhuter has now recovered from his wounds, but it will be some time before he can use his right arm with perfect ease again. He will probably carry the scars inflicted upon him by the lion for the rest of his life, grim mementos of his terrible experience. The end.